I've come to two conclusions about Adam Smith's position on slavery. The first is that he developed his position on slavery, his anti-slavery position, in response to actually existing racist anti-slavery positions. Second is that Smith's anti-slavery position is much more radical than we've understood it to be. Now, key to understanding this, or key to kind of showing that, is that he developed his thinking in 4 stages. And the first stage is represented by something called the Anderson Notes. Bet you haven't read it. The Anderson Notes is a collection of notes taken by some guy named Anderson in about 1749 or thereabouts at a lecture that Smith gave in 1749. Smith would have been 25 or 26 at the time. So it's the earliest record we've got of Smith's thinking on anything, and on slavery in particular. So it's 10 years before Smith published Theory of Moral Sentiments, 15 years before he delivered the lectures we know as the Lectures on Jurisprudence. Very early stage in his thinking on slavery. And he makes some interesting remarks there, which I might get to. But what's really interesting is that the passage on slavery in the Anderson Notes is actually, believe me, a draft of an anti-slavery passage found in Theory of Moral Sentiments, or the second stage in Smith's thinking. So in the second stage of Smith's thinking, he's got this draft of position on slavery, takes it, works it up, puts it into Theory of Moral Sentiments, and publishes it. It is responded to by 2 people within 5 years of its publication. The 2 people, the first is James Granger, who's a Scottish slave-owning poet, publishes The Sugar Cane, and in it, we now know, he's trying to attack Adam Smith. It's not that important. I mean, the poem is actually quite famous, but it's not that important what he says about Smith. Second is quite important, and it's an essay published by Arthur Lee. So Arthur Lee writes this essay directly responding to the passage in Theory of Moral Sentiments that was found in draft form in the Anderson Notes, right? So we're moving forward to 1764, but it points us back to Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, and then back 1749, Anderson Notes. Arthur Lee, who was he? Well, he was a student at Edinburgh at the time. He had been educated at Eton before that, but he was born at Stratford Hall, Virginia, to Thomas and Hannah Ludwell Lee, of that eminent Lee family of Virginia, whose most famous descendant is Robert E. Lee. Okay, Arthur published it, the essay anonymously, but he published it in London. Smith's publisher knew the publisher of it. Blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter if Smith knew who wrote it, although it's intriguing. Lee's essay, what's the purpose of Lee's essay? Well, he's strongly morally opposed to slavery, calls it unjust. He also thinks that there are economic problems with slavery. So I said Smith developed his position in response to actually existing racist anti-slavery positions. Lee is one of those. Lee held moral opposition to slavery, economic opposition to slavery, but he was ambitiously racist. That essay was ambitiously racist. Let's leave it at that. Lee thought that slavery is wrong, morally wrong, economically bad, but that doesn't entail that these enslaved Africans in America should be emancipated. Why not? Well, because of the racist beliefs undermine, they don't make the premises entail the conclusion. Because the enslaved Africans in America are morally and mentally inferior to the rest of humanity. So, you're not going to get an economic benefit from emancipating them because they're mentally inferior. They're not going to be as productive as free laborers. So it's true in general, if you free slaves, that you'll get this Pareto optimality from emancipating, but not in this case. And it's true that slaves are morally owed their freedom, but not these slaves. And moreover, if you freed them, they don't have the kind of morality that could allow them to be peaceful citizens and so on. So he basically writes to say that to Smith? Well, that and one more thing. The one more thing is Smith, I dare you to say more about slavery without slandering Americans, as Lee thought Smith had, and he had, and without praising these enslaved Africans. Smith had morally overpraised the enslaved Africans, treating them as kind of noble savages, but Lee interprets him as just, saying they're wonderful people, and he wants to say they're terrible people. So he says, I challenge you to say more about slavery. So his essay is one example of that racist anti-slavery position against which I say Smith developed his own position on slavery. Another example, the same constellation of views, moral opposition to slavery, economic opposition to slavery, racist beliefs which prevent the argument, if you will, entailing the conclusion that these enslaved Africans in America should be emancipated. I lost my train of thought here. That's David Hume. So Arthur Lee held that constellation of views. David Hume held the same constellation of views. I don't have to tell you that Hume was a friend and close friend and philosophical companion of Smith. I don't have to tell you as well that in 1753, Smith published a footnote to his essay Of National Characters, in which he basically said what Lee did, but without the gusto. It has significant gusto, but you should read Lee's essay. Lee's is far more extreme. Hume said the enslaved Africans in America don't have, and he was broader than that, but the enslaved Africans in America they have lower moral and mental capacities than the rest of humanity. Same thing as Lee. Same positions as Lee, moral and economic opposition to slavery, same racist beliefs which prevent the entailment of emancipation. Okay, so those are the positions I'm saying that Smith developed his own position in response to. Part of the grounds for being able to claim that is that Lee challenged him to develop his position, and Smith certainly would have known about the essay even if he didn't know about the identity of the author of it. So Lee challenges Smith, say more about slavery, but don't praise Africans and don't slander Americans. 1764, what does Smith publish next? 1776, Wealth of Nations. Okay, did he respond to Lee or to that constellation of views, that racist anti-slavery position in Wealth of Nations? Well, of course, Wealth of Nations is an enormous book. You can kind of p-hack and find, all kinds of responses to Lee's essay, some of which I think are genuine, but, it's very hard to settle it because it's very easy to link something even if there were actually no link. So let's just take the two biggest things Smith says in Wealth of Nations, the two biggest sort of new things about slavery that Smith says in Wealth of Nations, and ask, well, are those in any way responses to that racist anti-slavery constellation of ideas? Well, the two big new arguments in Wealth of Nations are these. One is that the institution of slavery is founded on pride, he says. The pride of man makes him love to domineer, he says. So that's one claim. And there are various ways of reading that, like that it might have been participating in a line of reasoning about what the institution of slavery is founded upon. But just take it that Smith says, it's founded on pride. That's, I want to put it this way, that's what it aims at. The institution of slavery aims at pride. But it commonly purports to aim at material gain. That was some of the original sort of justification for it, how it could be consistent with God's plan for us. Well, it's economically beneficial. So it purports to aim at economic efficiency, but it actually aims at serving the pride of the free, or the pride of masters in particular. So the other big argument that he makes, of course, this is more well known, is that slavery is economically inefficient. Well, could either of these two, pride or economic inefficiency, be responses to Hume and Lee or writers like them? Maybe. The pride claim, well, Lee certainly expresses pride in his essay. He describes Americans as genteel, he builds them up. John Locke wrote the Constitution of South Carolina, he shows off So, that maybe that's something. The economic inefficiency thing, well, that can't be a response to them because they granted that. They said it was economically efficient, as had many, 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 many writers before Smith. Of course, Smith's argument for its economic efficiency, while not great, is much better than existing arguments to that effect. But that doesn't really seem like a response to Lee and Hume, except for the fact that the economic argument is actually a series of arguments. So Smith describes it as economically inefficient, unproductive, by using a variety of arguments. And there's one important one, and it's this. Okay, the division of labor is good because when you focus on one task, you start to develop innovations that, quote, abridge labor, make the whole thing more productive. Free laborers, of course, have an incentive to do this. They have many incentives to do this. Let's just take an obvious one, like if they develop an innovation that abridges labor, they gain leverage on their employer to keep their job or to increase their wages. Of course, they could maybe take the innovation and start their own company, whatever. There are lots of reasons why they're incentivized to develop these innovations, and so we see them developing these innovations, right? In slavery, slaves don't have those incentives. Crucially, they do have the freedom to discover, if you separate these two, to discover and present innovations that abridge labor, present the innovation to their master. They do have the freedom to do that, if you like. They have the negative freedom to do that, but they're dominated, right? They've got the negative freedom to do that. Why would they have that negative freedom to discover and present innovations that abridge labor? Well, that's because slavery purports to aim at economic productivity. And it doesn't take Adam Smith to be able to notice that those innovations are good, right? You want people to be able to come up with them, so you allow them to, this is an economic enterprise here. We're going to allow innovations. So that's why they've got that freedom, because it purports to aim at economic efficiency or benefit, material gain. Thing is, though, slaves don't have the incentive free laborers have. So they probably won't discover or present innovations that abridge labor. Smith speculated that they did sometimes develop innovations that abridge labor that were accepted. The mill was one of them, he said. But the fact is, they're just not going to be inventive. Notice how that speaks to especially Hume's claim that he has observational evidence. I don't know where he gets his observations from. I know where Lee does, the family plantation. But Hume thinks he's got observational evidence that the slaves have lowered mental capacity. Why? Because they show no ingenious, quote, in manufacture. Essentially, they present no innovations. But Smith has just explained why they don't. They've got no incentive to do it. They might perfectly well discover innovations and have the mental capacity to do it without presenting them to the master. Why bother? The master's just going to work you whatever he's going to work you. And you don't gain any leverage on the master from that, and you can't start your own business from it. So, why bother presenting it? But notice that leads the free, or the master, to interpret any lack of presentation of innovations as a lack of the mental capacity to discover them, right? They're free to discover those things. They could, but they don't. Of course, the incentives are stopping them from doing that, but you can see how the master might not pay attention to that. Second thing is, sometimes they do discover and present innovations that abridge labor. I mentioned that mill one, but the mill one got accepted, apparently. But mostly, when a slave discovers and presents an innovation that abridges labor, the master is disposed to interpret that presentation of an innovation that abridges labor as the suggestion of, quote, laziness that's supposed to come at the expense of the whole enterprise. Why? Well, because slaves don't have incentives to present innovations that abridge labor, but they do, like anyone, have incentives to lessen their labor, to work less, to have less pain in laboring. Since that's their incentive, incentives affect interpretation, and masters interpret the presentation of an innovation that actually abridges labor productively as one that doesn't abridge labor productively, but rather unproductively. It harms the overall enterprise just for the benefit of the slave. That gets you a sense of their moral inferiority. How dare you? This is just for you at the expense of the thing. Don't you see we're in this enterprise for material gain, bounty, abundance, or something. So the institution of slavery, the structure of incentives on it, disposes masters to interpret whatever a slave does with respect to innovations that abridge labor as exhibiting lowered capacities, either mental or moral capacities. So, aha, David Hume, your evidence isn't good. It's not proof of anything, because you're not appreciating the incentives involved here, and you're misinterpreting the behavior of it. That argument is just that I'm just describing, is a more sophisticated version of one that James Beattie had made against Hume in 1770. 1770, Beattie publishes this book attacking Hume's epistemology. It's a dumb book, it doesn't work, it doesn't touch Hume's arguments, but he includes a section on it in which he attacks Hume's notorious 1753 footnote. And he makes a gesture at the argument I've just described Smith making, but he mainly makes worse arguments. He just sort of says, actually, there is some evidence that Africans have, are moral and do have mental capacity and stuff, which is kind of the wrong end of the stick. Is that the expression? They're not great arguments, but there's a seed of something there. Smith builds on the idea that you're not going to find evidence of mental and moral capacity among slaves because they have no incentives to show them. And you've always got a reason to believe that since they do have an incentive to labor less, that whenever they present an innovation that abridges labor, it's a suggestion of laziness. Okay, so I hope you see that argument that the institution of slavery purports to aim at economic activity, productivity, and so gives slaves freedom to innovate. I hope to see that the connection between that and the idea that slavery actually aims at serving the pride of masters. Because what's going on here? Well, the free can always think they're superior to someone once they've got these slaves and the incentives in place. They can kind of get themselves to believe that the incentives aren't, mucking with the evidence here, but giving me genuine evidence that these people are morally and mentally inferior to me. So it seems like the pride argument and the economic argument are coming together, and they're debunking the racist beliefs that are getting in the way of having moral and economic opposition to slavery entail the emancipation of these enslaved Africans in America. You follow me there? So Smith's developing his position over these stages. Anderson notes, TMS, Theory of Moral Sentiments, Wealth of Nations, in response to these actually existing views. Moral, economic opposition to slavery, racist beliefs that prevent those principled opposition to slavery entailing emancipation of the enslaved Africans. So the anti-slavery, racist anti-slavery position might entail in general emancipation, but not in particular in this particular case. But Smith is saying there's nothing unique about this case, and you don't have any evidence, credible evidence, for your racist beliefs. Okay, so I want to tie this together, but it can be done by turning to the fourth stage in Smith's thinking, which is Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1790. He comes back to the book and revises it. So did he respond to, the racist anti-slavery positions in it? Well, I don't know. He includes his strongest ever condemnation of slavery in it as the vilest of all states, as cruel, or something not less cruel than murder, something like this, which is just it repeats a phrase he says, like in slavery and chattel slavery, men, women, and children are sold like so many cattle to the highest bidder in a market. This is just an echo of something he had been taught when he was a student at Glasgow under Francis Hutcheson. It's a text from Gershom Carmichael. He's almost just plagiarizing Gershom Carmichael. So that's not that interesting, but adds a condemnation of slavery in 1790. What is interesting is that he adds a new analysis of pride and vanity. Pride and vanity, it spans like 5 pages or something. It's a substantial new analysis. Pride and vanity are both vices of, quote, excessive self-estimation. You think you're better than you are. But pride is distinguished from vanity in being held sincerely. The beliefs in your superiority are sincerely held. Let's just leave aside he calls it the vain man for now, and just talk about the proud man. So the proud man sincerely believes that he's superior to other people. So he doesn't want to be flattered. He only wants sincere praise of him and so. So he wants to always sincerely believe. He's honest with himself. He overestimates his value, but he's sincere about it. So one of the problems that the proud man runs into is that when he goes out into the everyday world, he finds that he's, I think I'm almost quoting, he finds that he's often among his equals and superiors. He's honest with himself that he is, and he doesn't like to be around his equals and superiors. Rather, he prefers to be around humbler company. And Smith says he doesn't willingly choose to do this, to be around the humbler company. It's costly to find people who are you want to be around a bit, but who are dumber and less virtuous than you are. It's a lot of work. So he has trouble going out into the world because he sees his equals and superiors everywhere. So he's got to find people who are worse than he is, but worth being around, at least for that reason. So he's got this kind of trouble, the proud man does. Like, you've got to find some way to get a social comparison where he regularly feels like and believably feels that he's better than these other people. Slavery manufactures those people. It manufactures the humbler company. Notice that a proud man sincerely believes he's better than other people, sincerely, like, he judges his own superiority. He tries to be honest with himself. He faces this difficult task. It's as if he wants to rig a competition of social comparison. But the problem is, as soon as you rig a competition of social comparison, you yourself know that you'll win it, right? If you rig a competition so that you'll win, you can't feel great about it because you only won because you rigged it. But notice that slavery kind of pulls a sleight of hand here. It purports to aim at economic efficiency, and that there are a long train of writings describing that. So that's not what you're doing when you're having slaves. You're not entering into a competition of social comparison with the enslaved. You're just trying to do economic productivity. As a side effect, though, you're regularly getting believable evidence that you're morally and mentally superior to the enslaved. And, oh, that's just this welcome thing. It doesn't seem to you, or you can kind of, self-deceive. It doesn't seem to you like this is just rigged to get that. What do you mean it's rigged to do that? What I'm doing is trying to, have a good plantation. And I just find that these people are worse than I am. They're a humbler company that you manufacture. Like, that's the point of the argument about the sort of division of labor or innovations that abridge labor thing. You're guaranteeing that if the slave discovers and presents an innovation that abridges labor, you can describe it as laziness because of the incentive structure. If they don't, you can describe it as lower mental capacity because they've got the freedom to find these things, but they just never do. So those things come together. There are other interesting things he says about pride there. He gives this warning that the proud man will die, as Hamlet says, unanointed, unannealed, with all the sins upon my head. So you'll die, whatever, without your last rites. The Hamlet who speaks that is King Hamlet, not Prince Hamlet. He's in purgatory. And that's a kind of, those kinds of warnings to prideful people when they were directed at slave masters were common in the era. Like that you'll die with sin on your head. So those are interesting things that you probably didn't know about, but I want to bring to your attention that if I'm right about this, that Smith is striking at anti-slavery, racist anti-slavery positions in Wealth of Nations and then TMS 1790, then he's striking at an important margin in a frontier in anti-slavery thought. That is the frontier between positions like Lee and Hume that were sort of concessive to everyday practice. So the frontier is between anti-slavery positions that were concessive to existing slavery and those that weren't, that were emancipationist or pro-insurrectionist. What Lee in particular was for, I don't think I mentioned this, what Lee in particular was for, he's remembered as an abolitionist, but he actually was for raising tariffs on the importation of slaves, humans, into America. Not surprisingly, or whatever, his family would benefit from that. They own hundreds of slaves, but people next door probably didn't own so many or didn't own any. He also says, Lee says, another thing we could do is just ship the slaves we've got off to, I believe it's the Barbados, it could be somewhere else, but ship them off to the Barbados where they'll live, his language is just awful, like they'll live miserable lives, but it'll be short or something. So he's not an emancipationist, right? The thing that's stopping him from calling for emancipation are his racist beliefs. This emancipating them won't be morally good or beneficial, and it won't be economically beneficial because they won't be good free laborers. Hume wasn't for emancipation. I don't think he had very particular views about what should happen. Of course, he wrote letters to Lord Hertford advising him on investments in the slave plantation in Grenada, and helped him secure this investment or something like that. So, Hume wasn't for emancipation. So Smith is striking at the margin between opposing slavery and having that entail something like emancipation. Rather, this position that I'm describing that he developed his position against is just for this kind of concessive, abolish the trade, raise tariffs, and so on. Now, I'll leave you with this. In the Anderson notes, I said that's a draft of TMS 1759. So let me get my notes here. I haven't been using notes so far, which is why it's all over the place. In Anderson notes, why should you read it? Well, I don't know, but because of this. So he's describing, Smith is, a series of cases of ideal type masters with ideal type slaves. So sometimes it's a master and a servant or something, and he's describing what makes masters treat slaves worse, better or worse. Sometimes being in proximity to the slave makes the master treat the slave better than when they're very distant. When they're very distant, their sense of their moral accountability to their slave is lowered and they treat them more cruelly. Sometimes wealth inequality between master and servant, master and slave, affects the treatment. The more unequal they are in wealth, or the wealthier or the free are, the worse they are to the enslaved. Now he turns to the contemporary case, and he says, "And as the blacks seem not from their skin to partake of the same nature with the whites, the imagination of a barbarous white supposes him not to be of the same nature with himself, and therefore uses him ill with less scruple." Now, it's hard to follow what I just said there. It's much like something Montesquieu had said the year prior to this lecture, but Smith begins by saying, it might be that the blacks seem not from their skin to partake of the same nature with the whites, but there's a difference. We all might think that, and he says a similar thing in Theory of Moral Sentiments when he talks about deformity in our views of beauty. So we all have different senses of beauty and stuff, but there's a difference in barbarous whites. The imagination of a barbarous white supposes the blacks not to be of the same nature with the whites, and therefore uses him ill with less scruple. That becomes, in Theory of Moral Sentiments, I can really thoroughly prove this claim, which is the one that Arthur Lee responded to. Let's not read it all, but it ends like this. The masters are so vicious that they are justly exposed to the contempt of the vanquished, justly exposed to the contempt of the enslaved. So the question is, this is what I want to leave you with. The question is, I said Smith has a more radical anti-slavery position than has been commonly believed. I tried to give some reason for why that might be the case. He's striking at this frontier, moving anti-slavery activists closer to emancipation. But another place we might find that he's more radical is interpreting that. What does he mean that the masters are justly exposed to the contempt of the vanquished? So that's your question. But you should know that when Smith says justly exposed to contempt, he's using the technical language of his own moral philosophy, right? Smith is a sentimentalist, Theory of Moral Sentiments. When he describes a sentiment, there are occasions in which the sentiment's just expressed, so somebody's praised, but they're not praiseworthy, or they're not justly exposed to praise. When he says somebody's justly exposed to sentiment, justly exposed to contempt, he means it's rightfully held. This is a conclusion of his moral philosophy. So the important thing is that in saying that the masters in America are justly exposed to contempt, you shouldn't think at first, at least at first, that that's Smith just kind of slandering them, that he's just kind of tossing something off. It's a conclusion expressed in the technical terms of his moral philosophy. So ask yourself, what does contempt mean? And how would that relate to a degree of radicality in your anti-slavery position? I've got so much more to say about this, but I was just restless. I've got a cold and stuff, and wanted to shoot off some basic things that you might not have known. Thanks.